Hello dear, and welcome to Farloom. Tonight we follow water. Not as a substance but as something closer to an instruction, deciding where a house gets built, when a meal gets cooked, how a day begins, and how an entire community learns to move through its hours. In some places, water arrives so rarely that a single well becomes the center of a village and every path seems to lean quietly toward it. In others, water hardly stops at all, and life is built to float, to lift, to wait it out under a wide roof. On a mountainside, ice can hold water in place for months, releasing it later, exactly when a field needs it most. A city can grow not beside water, but on top of it, learning to rise and settle with the tide like something breathing. Somewhere else, rain falls so often and so heavily that a wooden bridge would rot before anyone finished building it. So a bridge is grown instead, slowly, out of living roots. None of this feels unusual to the people who live it. It is simply how the day works in a place water-shaped long before anyone chose to settle there. If you enjoy these long, quiet journeys through the way people live, you're always welcome to subscribe or leave a thought below about the place water has shaped in your own life. This might be a good moment to get comfortable. Let your shoulders soften into whatever is holding you tonight. Let your breathing slow, just slightly, at its own pace. There is nowhere else you need to be right now, and nothing here you're required to remember. Simply let the day fade a little behind you. Let's begin. Long before anyone thought of geography as a subject to be studied, people were already reading rivers as instructions. A river that flooded every year and left behind a layer of dark, fertile silt was, in effect, renewing the soil on a schedule, season after season, without being asked. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now Iraq, this pattern repeated so reliably that some of the earliest cities in human history grew directly out of it. Farmers did not need to guess where the richest ground would be. The river told them every year, by leaving a fresh layer exactly where the water had reached. A similar rhythm shaped settlements along the Nile, where the flood was so dependable for thousands of years that calendars, taxes, and planting schedules were built directly around it. A civilization did not simply happen to be near water. It was organized by it, from the first furrow to the first city wall. Not every settlement had a great river to read. In the desert oases of North Africa, a village might exist almost entirely because water rises to the surface at one specific point, surrounded by palm trees whose roots reach far enough underground to survive on it year-round. Houses cluster close to that spring, not for convenience, but because distance from water used to mean real hardship. Streets curve toward it. Narrow, shaded gardens sit nearby, fed by channels dug generations earlier and still carefully maintained. Walk through a small oasis town today, and you can often trace, without being told, exactly where the water is, simply by noticing which direction everything seems to lean. A well, though, has rarely been just a water source. It has often doubled as one of the few places in a community where people are guaranteed to meet regularly without needing an invitation. News travels at a well. Small disagreements get settled there, and occasionally started there too. In many villages, this is where a newcomer first becomes genuinely known, not through any formal introduction, but simply by showing up day after day at the same hour as everyone else, until a nod turns into a conversation. Not all water announces itself so clearly, though. Beneath a dry landscape, rain that fell years, sometimes centuries earlier, can still be moving slowly through layers of sand and porous rock, gathering in reservoirs no one can see from the surface. This groundwater does not follow the same calendar as rain. It can sit largely undisturbed through a drought severe enough to empty every visible river nearby. A community that learns to reach this hidden layer through a well dug deep enough gains something rarer than water itself, a supply that does not depend on the weather happening outside on that particular day. Water access could also be built directly into a city's architecture, long before anyone used that language to describe it. In the ancient cities of the Indus Valley, in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, archaeologists have found that many ordinary houses were connected to private wells and to a network of covered drains running beneath the streets. Bathing platforms sat inside individual homes, feeding used water into channels that carried it well away from the living space. This was not a comfort reserved for the wealthy. It appears to have been closer to a city-wide expectation, built into the plan of the settlement from the very beginning. Long before the words plumbing or sanitation existed, the idea behind them clearly already did. Where a river doesn't simply flow past, but spreads into wide, shallow marshland, people have sometimes chosen to build with the water itself, rather than beside it. In southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates fan out into a maze of reed marshes, communities have for centuries built houses and even large meeting halls entirely from bundled marsh reeds, sometimes raised on artificial islands woven from the same material. Water buffalo move between the structures. Boats, not roads, connect one household to the next. When a reed structure eventually wears out, it isn't repaired so much as rebuilt, using materials growing in abundance just outside the door. It is architecture that assumes water is permanent and builds accordingly, rather than trying to keep it out. Access to water has always come with a second, quieter decision though. How close is too close? A river generous enough to enrich a field can just as easily rise over it without warning. Along many floodplains, the older core of a town sits noticeably higher than the land around it, often on a ridge or a mound raised gradually over generations, while the lower ground nearby is reserved for fields that can afford an occasional flood. Along stretches of the Mekong and the Ganges, houses have long been raised on wooden or bamboo stilts, not for decoration, but as a direct, practical answer to a river that predictably rises each year and just as predictably falls again. The house does not fight the water. It simply lifts itself a little and waits for the season to pass. Before roads existed in any organized sense, rivers already were roads. A boat can carry far more than a person walking, and with far less effort, which made river systems the original routes for trade, marriage, news, and everything else that needed to travel between communities. Villages grew at bends, confluences, and calm stretches of water where boats could load and unload safely. A market did not need to sit near the richest farmland. It needed to sit near the water that could carry goods to it. Even now, in river cities scattered from the Mekong to the Amazon, some of the busiest hours of the day are still set by boat traffic rather than road traffic, and running an errand can mean stepping into a canoe rather than out onto a street. A river also has a particular social effect that a spring or a well rarely produces in quite the same way. It connects communities who may never meet, through water alone. What happens upstream, whether a village builds a small dam, diverts a channel toward its fields, or simply draws more water than usual during a dry year, eventually reaches whoever lives downstream. River communities have therefore needed, for a very long time, some shared understanding of how much water it is reasonable to take and when. Sometimes that understanding is written into a formal agreement between towns or regions. More often, it is simply custom, passed down the same unspoken way a well's location is passed down, a working sense of what belongs to the river itself and what can be reasonably borrowed from it for a season. Where water has to be carried rather than simply reached at will, it quietly organizes the rest of the day around itself. In parts of the Horn of Africa and the wider Sahel, a walk to the nearest well or borehole can take an hour or more and is usually made in the cooler part of early morning, before the heat makes the same walk considerably harder. This is not a small errand slotted around a schedule. In many households, it effectively is the schedule, shaping what time everyone wakes, who is free for other work that day, and how far from home daily life can reasonably extend. Distance from water, more than almost any other single factor, can decide whether a child reaches school on time or whether a family stays on land they know well, rather than moving somewhere with better soil but no dependable source nearby. Rivers, springs, and wells offer something relatively steady, a source that can, with real effort, usually be reached on most days of the year. Rain behaves quite differently. Across much of the world, water does not arrive steadily at all. It arrives in a season, sometimes concentrated into a matter of weeks, with the rest of the year left largely dry. Life in these regions is organized less around a place where water is and more around a time when it comes. Planting, building, travel, even certain festivals are timed around the arrival of rain, because missing that window can mean waiting a full year for the next one to open. Few places make this rhythm as vivid as the hills of Meghalaya in northeastern India. The area around Mauzinram and Cherrapunji regularly records some of the highest rainfall measured anywhere on Earth, as monsoon winds sweep in from the Bay of Bengal and are forced sharply upward against the hills, releasing their moisture almost as soon as they arrive. For months at a stretch, rain here is less an event than a constant condition, heavy enough that an ordinary wooden bridge would rot and collapse long before it could be finished. Communities responded with something unusual. Instead of building a bridge, they grew one. The aerial roots of rubber fig trees are patiently guided over years across a river, woven and trained until they form a living structure strong enough to carry people safely across. Some of these root bridges have been growing for well over a century, and unlike almost anything built rather than grown, they tend to become stronger, not weaker, with age and with rain. Across much of South and Southeast Asia more broadly, the monsoon functions less like ordinary weather and more like an appointment the entire year is arranged around. Its arrival is watched for, discussed, and in farming communities waited on with real consequences attached. Rice, the staple crop across much of the region, generally needs to be planted within a fairly narrow window once the rains begin, so a monsoon that arrives late or weaker than expected doesn't just mean a drier month. It can mean a smaller harvest, higher food prices later in the year, and a noticeably harder season for anyone whose income depends on that single planting. A farmer checking the sky each morning in the weeks before the rains are due isn't being sentimental. It is closer to reading a forecast for the entire year ahead, with no way to move the appointment if it happens to run late. The weeks before the rains arrive are rarely idle ones. Roofs are checked and reinforced. Drainage channels around a house are cleared of whatever debris gathered during the dry months. Grain and other stores are moved onto higher, drier shelves, sometimes onto a raised platform built specifically for this purpose. Boats are patched and made ready, since for several months they may become as necessary as any door or window. None of this work looks dramatic on its own, but taken together, it amounts to an entire household quietly rebuilding itself around a season that hasn't started yet, on nothing more than the confident expectation that it will. There is a particular smell that tends to arrive with those first rains after a long, dry spell, familiar enough that most people recognize it instantly, even if few could name it. Certain plants release a light oil during dry periods, which settles onto soil and stone and simply waits there. When rain finally falls, it disturbs that oil, along with a compound produced by ordinary soil bacteria, releasing both into the air at once. Scientists gave this combined scent a name in the 1960s, petrichor, built from Greek words roughly meaning the fluid of the gods and stone. It tends to be strongest after the longest dry spells, which may be part of why it feels so distinct. The ground, in a sense, has simply been storing that smell, waiting for the one event able to release it. Architecture responds to this rhythm just as clearly as farming does. In regions that expect months of heavy rain each year, roofs tend to be built steep, encouraging water to run off quickly rather than pool and eventually seep through. Wide eaves extend well beyond the walls, keeping both the building and anyone standing near it reasonably dry, even in a full downpour. Along parts of coastal India and Southeast Asia, open verandas wrap around houses specifically so that ordinary life, cooking, visiting, simply sitting outside, can continue while rain falls steadily just beyond the edge of the roof. None of this needs explaining to the people who live there. A steep roof and a deep eave are, in effect, a very old and very practical form of weather forecasting, built directly into the shape of a home. During the heaviest part of a rainy season, a downpour doesn't usually stop a day so much as briefly reroute it. Market stalls are built with wide awnings for exactly this reason, letting trade continue almost without pause while sheets of water run off just beyond the goods for sale. Tea stalls and small shops tend to fill quickly once the rain begins, less because people are seeking shelter, and more because a sudden downpour has simply become an expected part of the afternoon, better waited out in company than alone. Life doesn't stop for rain in these places. It shifts a few steps to one side, under whatever roof is nearest, and carries on largely unbothered. Two very different pictures start to emerge once water is looked at this closely. In one, a village grows patiently around a spring or a well, in a place where every drop has to be found, carried and used carefully. In the other, an entire season is timed around rain heavy enough to grow bridges out of living trees, and a house is built with its roof and eaves already anticipating months of downpour. Both are shaped by the same substance, arriving in almost opposite amounts, and both have organized nearly everything else around that single fact. Between those two extremes sits a much larger, quieter category of places, where rain is expected most years, but never entirely guaranteed, where a river usually rises on schedule but occasionally doesn't, and where the difference between an ordinary year and a genuinely difficult one can come down to a single week or late rainy season. It is in that uncertain middle ground, more than almost anywhere else, that people have spent centuries learning to read the sky, the soil, and the river, simply to know what kind of year they are about to live through. In some places, though, there is no uncertain middle ground to read. Rain does not arrive late or weak in a given year because it barely arrives at all. Parts of the Atacama Desert along the coast of Chile sit among the driest places ever measured on Earth, with some weather stations recording no rainfall whatsoever across years of records. Large stretches of the Sahara go decades between meaningful rain. In these landscapes, the question stops being when water will come and becomes something closer to how a life gets lived without it, using whatever water exists elsewhere, underground, in the air, or carried in from somewhere else entirely. For a very long time, one answer was simply movement, organized entirely around where water happened to be. Camel caravans crossing the Sahara did not travel in straight lines toward a destination. They moved from well to well. In stages, a camel and its riders could realistically survive between one water source and the next. The spacing of those wells, more than any map or compass, decided where a route could exist at all. And an oasis was rarely the goal of a journey, so much as a necessary stop along the way to somewhere else. Entire trade networks carrying salt, gold, cloth, and news across a continent were shaped less by geography in the usual sense than by the simple, unforgiving arithmetic of how far a person or animal could go before needing to drink again. Other communities chose not to move and instead brought water to themselves, using little more than gravity and patience. In Iran, engineers were building qanats at least 3,000 years ago, and some are still working today. The idea is simple to describe and remarkably difficult to execute well. A tunnel is dug, gently sloping downward, from an aquifer inside a mountain or beneath a fan of gravel at its base, all the way to a distant village or field, low enough that the water flows the entire distance on its own without a single pump. Skilled diggers, known as muqanis, would sink a deep well, sometimes close to 100 meters down, to confirm where the water sat, and then work backward, excavating the connecting tunnel by hand, guided by a line of smaller vertical shafts sunk at intervals along the route, which also let air in and let workers climb out. Some qanats run for barely a kilometer. Others stretch for 50, threading beneath a desert for a distance most people would consider a long day's drive, let alone a walk through a tunnel. One system at Gonabad in northeastern Iran dates to roughly the 6th century BCE and is still delivering water today, still doing, without modification, the job it was dug to do well over 2,000 years ago. In 2016, a group of 11 qanats from across the country was recognized internationally for the sophistication of their engineering. Countless others, just as old and just as functional, continue quietly supplying towns and fields without any such recognition at all, simply because they have never stopped working. Digging a qanat was never simple or entirely safe work, and the skill involved in doing it well was passed down carefully, often within particular families, across many generations. A Mekani needed to judge, with only rudimentary tools, exactly how steep a slope would let water flow steadily without eroding the tunnel walls too quickly, and exactly how deep to dig before striking useful groundwater rather than dry rock. Tunnels sometimes collapsed. Workers occasionally lost their lives digging them. Yet the finished result required almost no ongoing energy to operate, no fuel, no pump, nothing beyond periodic clearing of silt and the occasional repair of a collapsed section, which meant a qanat completed once could, in principle, keep working for as long as anyone bothered to maintain it. Many have done exactly that quietly for well over 1,000 years. A strikingly similar idea appears far to the east in the Turpan Basin of northwestern China, among the hottest and driest inland basins on Earth, with parts of it sitting well below sea level. There, underground channels known locally as qares carry meltwater from the distant Tian Shan Mountains across dozens of kilometers of scorching desert to the oasis towns below, using the same gravity-fed logic as a Persian qanat, and losing far less water to evaporation than any open channel could manage in that heat. Historians still debate whether the idea traveled slowly along trade routes connecting the two regions over centuries, or whether two unrelated societies, faced with the same basic problem of moving water across a hot, dry distance without losing it to the sky, simply arrived at the same solution on their own. Either way, the tunnels have gone on doing the same patient job in both places for a very long time. Water moving slowly underground also solved a second problem that has nothing to do with thirst directly: heat. In the desert city of Yazd in central Iran, tall towers rise above many rooftops, open on one or more sides near the top, built specifically to catch any breath of moving air and funnel it downward into the building below. These wind catchers, known locally as badgirs, often worked alongside a qanat running beneath the house, allowing air passing over the cool flowing water underground to lose several degrees before it ever reached a room where people were sitting or sleeping. No electricity and no moving parts were involved in any of it. Just a tower shaped to catch wind and a tunnel shaped to carry water, working together to make an unbearable climate merely uncomfortable. Water this hard to obtain could not simply be used however anyone wished, and many communities that depended on a shared qanat or canal developed detailed systems for dividing it fairly. In parts of Afghanistan and Central Asia, a role known as the mirab, roughly meaning watermaster, still exists in some villages, responsible for overseeing exactly how a shared water source gets distributed among the families with a right to use it. Allocations have often been measured in time rather than volume. A household entitled to a canal's full flow for a set period on a set day before the water is redirected to the next household in line. Disputes over a few minutes of water access have, in some regions, mattered as much as disputes over land itself, because in a very real sense, without the water, the land was worth very little at all. Not every arid landscape sits far from the sea, and not every solution to scarcity involves digging downward. Along the coasts of Chile and Peru, thick fog rolls in from the cold ocean current offshore almost daily, even in places where rain essentially never falls. local communities have learned to hang large mesh nets across hillsides directly in the fog's path, allowing tiny droplets to collect on the fine netting and trickle down into collection channels below. A single well-placed net can gather a meaningful amount of drinkable water purely from air that would otherwise simply drift past and disappear inland. These fog-fed slopes, known locally as lomas, also support small, unlikely patches of vegetation found almost nowhere else nearby, greenery that survives entirely on moisture pulled directly from passing cloud, in a desert that may not have produced measurable rain in living memory. For a few weeks each year, when the fog is thickest, a hillside that looked entirely lifeless can turn faintly green almost overnight, before fading back to bare rock and sand once the fog season passes, a cycle so consistent that some communities have learned to time small-scale planting around it. Far to the southwest, along the southern edge of the Sahara, in the Bandiagara escarpment of central Mali, entire villages have been built directly into a long, dramatic line of sandstone cliffs. Water here has always been scarce and hard-won, gathered from a handful of seasonal springs and shallow wells shared carefully across a community. Below the cliffs, on the narrow strip of land where a little more moisture collects, small terraced gardens are tended with real precision. Onions among the most common crops, grown in plots watered by hand, one measured amount at a time, rather than left to any irrigation channel to manage on its own. Every plant in a garden like this represents water someone carried there personally, which tends to produce a very different relationship with a crop than simply turning on a tap. The cliffs themselves were chosen for more than one reason, offering shelter and a defensible position in earlier centuries, but their nearness to the handful of reliable springs mattered just as much as the height. And the two considerations, safety and water, were rarely separated in choosing exactly where a village would stand. That relationship extends to people as well as plants. Across many of the world's driest regions, from North Africa through the Middle East and into Central Asia, offering water to a traveler or a stranger carries a weight that can be difficult to fully appreciate from somewhere water runs freely from a tap. It is often described as one of the most basic obligations of hospitality, precisely because it is among the most costly things a household can give away without a second thought. A guest is rarely asked to prove their need. The water is simply offered, understood as something too fundamental to withhold, even when supplies at home are thin. In a place with abundant rainfall, the same gesture might barely register as generosity at all. In a place where every liter has been carried, dug, or netted from the air by hand, it can mean something closer to trust itself, extended before a single word has been exchanged. Where water is this precious, it tends to become its own kind of property, sometimes tracked separately from the land it flows across. In parts of the arid American Southwest, water rights have historically been treated almost as a currency of their own, allocated according to who first put a given water source to use and passed down, sold, or disputed independently of who owns the surrounding ground. A farm without water rights attached to it, in country dry enough to need irrigation for almost anything to grow, can be nearly worthless, regardless of how much land comes with it, while a comparatively small plot with a secure senior claim to a stream can support a family for generations. The pattern isn't unique to one region. Wherever water is genuinely scarce, some version of the same idea tends to appear. Land is only as valuable as the water a person has a recognized claim to use on it. Scarcity has also, at times, quietly ended a place altogether. Across the historical record, from settlements along the edges of the Sahara to abandoned towns scattered through the American Southwest, archaeologists have found communities that appear to have thrived for generations before being left behind entirely, often around the same period that nearby water sources measurably failed, whether through prolonged drought, a shifting river channel, or a spring that simply stopped flowing. Homes and even entire irrigation systems can be found intact, abandoned not through conflict or disaster in the usual sense, but because the water that had made the location worth choosing in the first place was no longer there to choose it for. Not every part of the world faces the problem of too little water, of course. On the opposite end of the same scale sits water that exists in abundance, but arrives locked into a form no one can drink directly. At least not yet. High in the world's great mountain ranges, snow that falls across a winter does not simply vanish once the season ends. It compresses, layer upon layer, into ice that can persist for centuries, forming glaciers that release their water gradually through the warmer months, exactly when the rivers below need it most. The Hindu Kush and Himalayan ranges alone hold enough stored ice and snow to be sometimes described as the planet's third pole, a title earned by the sheer volume of frozen water sitting at that altitude, second only to the Arctic and Antarctic. Rivers born this way carry that stored water an extraordinary distance before anyone downstream ever sees a mountain. The Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Mekong and the Yangtze all begin in one form or another as meltwater high on the Tibetan plateau, arriving eventually at farmland, cities and coastlines, thousands of kilometers from the ice that first released it. A farmer irrigating a rice paddy near a river's mouth may never see snow in an entire lifetime, and yet the water reaching that field began months earlier, as ice sitting quietly on a mountainside most of the watershed's population will never visit. Closer to the ice itself, communities have organized their entire year around the same slow release. Herders across the Alps, the Andes, and the high valleys of Central Asia have long practiced a seasonal rhythm in which livestock are moved gradually upward through spring and summer, following the retreating snowline and the fresh grass that appears in its wake, before being brought back down again as autumn cools the high pastures. The animals are, in effect, chasing meltwater indirectly through the grass it grows, and a herding family's calendar is built almost entirely around knowing which slopes will be green and wet enough to graze at which point in the year. High in Ladakh, in the mountains of northern India, one community found a more direct way to work with the same seasonal mismatch. Streams there swell with meltwater in summer, often after the planting season for barley and other crops has already passed, leaving fields dry precisely when they need water most. An engineer named Chuang Norfel noticed that water trickling slowly beneath the shade of poplar trees tended to freeze solid in winter, while faster-moving water nearby did not, and realized that slowing a stream down was enough to turn it to ice. He began diverting mountain streams into shaded valleys each winter, using simple stone checks to slow their flow until they froze into towering columns of ice, sometimes called ice stupas for their resemblance to the region's Buddhist monuments. Positioned at lower elevations than natural glaciers, These frozen reserves melt earlier in spring, releasing their water directly onto the fields at the moment crops actually need it, months before the mountains above would otherwise have let any of it go. One of the larger ice formations built this way, near the village of Puktsi, has measured well over 300 meters long and has been enough on its own to support water needs for hundreds of people through the driest weeks of spring. There is a certain symmetry between a qanat carrying groundwater sideways through a desert and a stone check freezing a mountain stream into a column of ice. Neither adds a single drop of new water to a landscape. Both simply hold water that already exists, briefly, in exactly the place and season where it would otherwise be missing, and then let it go again, right when it's needed. Scarcity, looked at closely enough, rarely turns out to be a simple absence of water. Far more often, it is a mismatch of timing and location, and much of human ingenuity across deserts and glaciers alike has been spent quietly closing that gap. There is an opposite kind of relationship with water found in places where the difficulty was never getting enough of it, but keeping it far enough away. Along many coastlines, the sea does not arrive in a season and then recede for months, the way a monsoon does. It arrives twice a day, every day, rising and falling on a schedule that has nothing to do with sunrise, clocks, or the working week, and communities that live close to it have had little choice but to build their entire rhythm around it instead. Not every tide behaves the same way, even along the same coastline. Twice a month, when the sun and moon line up with the earth, their combined pull produces what's known as a spring tide, in which the water rises higher and falls lower than usual. In the weeks between, when the sun and moon are pulling at right angles to each other, the difference between high and low water shrinks into what's called a neap tide, far gentler and less dramatic. Coastal communities have long planned around this 2-week rhythm as carefully as they plan around the daily one, timing certain kinds of fishing, boat launches, or harbor repairs to the widest possible stretch of exposed shoreline a spring tide reliably provides. Fishing communities along tidal coastlines have long understood the falling tide as an opportunity rather than simply an absence of water. As the sea retreats twice daily, it exposes wide stretches of mud and sand that were underwater only hours earlier, and in many regions, low walls of stone or woven branches have been built directly across these flats, arranged in a gentle curve or a V shape pointing toward open water. Fish swimming in with the rising tide pass easily over the low barrier. But as the water falls again, the wall traps them behind it, left stranded in shallow pools easy enough to gather by hand or net. Some of these weirs, found from the coasts of Wales to the shores of the Pacific Northwest, have been rebuilt on the same stone foundations for many centuries, the structure itself outlasting generations of the people who maintained it. Archaeologists have even found the wooden stakes of weirs preserved in coastal mud for thousands of years, protected from decay by the same low oxygen conditions that keep other timber intact underwater long after the people who built them are otherwise forgotten. Tides were put to work in other ways too, not only to trap fish, but to grind grain. Along stretches of the European coast, mills were built beside narrow tidal inlets, fitted with a gate that closed as the tide rose, trapping a large pond of seawater behind it. As the tide fell outside, that trapped water was released through a narrow channel back toward the sea, and the force of it, funneled and controlled, was enough to turn a mill wheel and grind grain entirely independent of wind or a flowing river. A tide mill produced power on a schedule set by the moon rather than the weather, which made it, in its own way, more dependable than either a windmill or a watermill relying on rainfall, since the tide, unlike wind or rain, never simply fails to arrive. The rhythm of a fishing port tends to follow the tide just as closely as the fishing itself. Boats built with a shallow enough draft time their return to a rising tide, which lifts them safely over a harbour bar or shallow channel that would leave them stranded at any other hour. A market held beside a tidal harbour often has no fixed opening time in the ordinary sense. It opens roughly when the boats do, which shifts gradually earlier or later across the days of a month, tracking the moon rather than the clock, until a fishmonger's working day may begin at dawn one week and well before it the next. The tidal zone has also been farmed directly, not just fished. In Mont Saint-Michel Bay, on the coast of Brittany, rows of wooden poles rise out of the mud in long, orderly lines, each one wrapped in a thick coil of young mussels that were attached to it as tiny larvae months earlier. Twice a day, the tide covers the poles entirely, delivering a fresh supply of plankton for the mussels to feed on, then retreats again and leaves them exposed, visible from a distance as dark, furred columns standing in the flats. At harvest time, farmers move between the poles at low tide, sometimes using specially adapted tractors built to cross soft mud, working within the narrow window each day when the sea allows it, before the water returns and the whole process pauses again until the next low tide. Some communities took a more direct approach to the problem of a rising sea, choosing to build not around the water's reach, but on top of it entirely. Venice, spread across more than 100 small islands within a shallow lagoon on Italy's northeastern coast, sits on foundations of densely packed wooden piles, mostly cut from alder trees, driven straight down through soft mud and clay until they reached firmer ground beneath. Ordinarily, wood submerged in water rots quickly, but the brackish, largely oxygen-free water of the lagoon starves the fungi and organisms that would normally cause that decay, while minerals in the water gradually harden the wood itself over time. Timber platforms were laid across the tops of these piles, and stone and brick buildings were raised on top of that, a foundation method so effective that some of it has now been quietly holding up the city for well over 1,000 years. Living on a foundation like that has never meant living free of the sea's daily pressure, though. Venice regularly experiences what's known locally as aqua alta, an unusually high tide that can push seawater directly into the streets and squares of the lower parts of the city, sometimes for a few hours at a time before receding again. For generations, the practical response was straightforward. Raised wooden walkways, assembled temporarily across the most exposed piazzas, letting daily life continue a little above the water rather than through it. It was a workable solution, but not a permanent one, and the flooding over recent decades has tended to arrive more often and reach higher than it once did. A more ambitious answer finally arrived in the form of a system of enormous mobile barriers installed along the openings that connect Venice's lagoon to the open sea. 78 bright yellow gates rest on the seabed under ordinary conditions, invisible and out of the way. When a sufficiently high tide is forecast, they fill with air and rise up from the bottom, forming a temporary wall across the lagoon's entrances and holding the sea back until the tide passes and the gates can be lowered again. On the 3rd of October 2020, the barrier was raised for the first time during an actual high tide. And for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, the city's famous square stayed completely dry through a tide that would, only a year earlier, have left it submerged. Venice is far from the only city to have built a mechanical answer to a rising sea. London sits on a tidal river too, and since the 1980s, a series of enormous steel gates has spanned the River Thames east of the city centre, lying flat and invisible on the riverbed under normal conditions. When forecasters expect a surge of water pushing in from the North Sea, the gates rotate upward until they form a solid wall across the entire width of the river, holding back a surge that would otherwise travel upstream and flood the low-lying heart of the city. Unlike Venice's barrier, built mainly for a slow, familiar tide, London's was built for something more sudden, a storm surge that might arrive with only hours of warning, which is part of why the gates were designed to close within minutes rather than the gradual, patient hours a rising tide usually allows for. Not every coastline has had the benefit of a barrier at all, and for most of history, none did. On the eastern coast of England, the town of Dunwich was once among the most important ports in the country, a genuine medieval capital of the region, home to several thousand people, a dozen churches, a market square, and a busy harbour recorded in the country's earliest land surveys. Severe storms in 1286 and 1347 tore through the town, and the coastal erosion that followed never really stopped. Street by street, church by church, Dunwich slipped into the North Sea over the following centuries, until almost nothing visible remained above the waterline. What survives today is a small village of a few streets and a single pub, sitting near the edge of a shoreline still quietly retreating, with the ruins of the old town somewhere beneath the waves offshore, an entire medieval city that the sea, given enough time and no barrier at all, simply absorbed. Not every coastal nation has simply defended what it already had either. The Netherlands took a broader approach, choosing over centuries to push the water back entirely and claim new land in its place. Roughly a quarter of the country sits below sea level today, a fact that would ordinarily make it deeply unsuitable for permanent settlement, and for a very long time, it very nearly was. Villages built along the coast lost land steadily to the sea for hundreds of years, entire inland bays where dry farmland once stood, before Dutch engineers began, methodically, to reverse the process. A well-known local saying captures the relationship with a certain dry humour, that while other places were simply given their land, the Dutch had to build theirs, one dike and one drained field at a time. It is, in a sense, a fairly literal description rather than a boast, and it shapes something close to a national instinct for treating water not as scenery, but as an ongoing piece of infrastructure that has to be actively managed every single day, indefinitely. The tool for doing so, in its earliest and simplest form, was the windmill. At Kinderdijk, 19 of them still stand today, most built around 1740. Arranged in careful rows across a landscape they were built specifically to drain. Each mill used the power of the wind to lift water out of a low-lying polder and into a higher canal or reservoir, from where it could eventually reach a river and flow out to sea on its own. It was slow, patient work, one windmill's worth of lifted water at a time, but repeated across hundreds of mills over centuries. It steadily turned marsh and shallow bay into some of the most productive farmland in the country. Electric pumps have long since taken over the actual draining, but the windmills at Kinderdijk still turn, maintained now more for what they represent than for the water they use to move. Reclaiming land from the sea was rarely finished the moment a dike closed a gap. A newly enclosed polder still had to be drained gradually, then left for a season or two to grow tough reeds and rough grasses that could tolerate the salty soil left behind by the sea. Only once those first plants had broken down the salt and improved the ground could a farmer risk something more delicate, first a hardy crop like rapeseed, and only years later, proper grain. An entire town might not exist yet at all when the first reeds were planted, arriving only once the ground beneath it had spent years quietly becoming farmland. The sea did not give up this land willingly, and it occasionally reminded the country of exactly how much force still sat on the other side of every dike. In early 1953, a severe storm combined with an unusually high spring tide to overwhelm dikes across the southwestern Netherlands, flooding a wide stretch of the country overnight and killing close to 2,000 people. Many in villages that had felt secure behind defences considered more than adequate. The disaster led directly to the Delta Works, a new and far larger generation of dams, sluices and storm surge barriers built across the region's river mouths, engineered specifically so that a flood on that scale, officials decided afterward, should never again be allowed to happen unnoticed until it was already inside people's homes. Not every defense against the sea has been built from steel or stone. Along the vast delta where the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers meet the Bay of Bengal, spanning the border between India and Bangladesh, the Sundarbans form the largest mangrove forest on Earth, a dense tangle of salt-tolerant trees rooted directly in tidal mud. Their thick, interlocking roots do quietly what a dike does more forcefully. They slow incoming water, absorb some of the force of a storm surge before it reaches the villages further inland, and hold the shifting delta soil in place against the constant pull of the tide. Communities living at the forest's edge have long understood this protection well enough to treat the mangroves themselves as something worth defending, since a coastline stripped of them tends to flood harder and more often than one left alone. Villages here also share the delta with tigers, a detail that shapes daily routines of its own. Since gathering honey, fishing or collecting wood along the forest edge has always meant working somewhere that never fully belonged to people alone, tide and predator both treated with the same wary respect. Not everything drawn from the sea in these regions was aimed at keeping the water out. Along the coast of Brittany in northwestern France, a network of shallow clay basins near the town of Guérande has been used for close to 1,000 years to produce salt through nothing more complicated than sun, wind, and careful timing. Seawater is guided through a series of increasingly shallow ponds, evaporating a little further at each stage until what remains in the final, smallest basins is salt alone, gathered by hand using wide wooden rakes by workers known locally as paludiers. The lightest, most delicate crystals, formed only on days with exactly the right combination of sun and breeze, are skimmed from the surface before they even sink, sold separately as fleur de sel, and the entire harvest still depends, as it always has, on weather that cannot be scheduled and must simply be watched for. A single basin can be worked by the same family for generations. The clay walls rebuilt by hand each spring after winter storms have softened and reshaped them in a landscape that looks, from above, less like a farm than a vast shallow mosaic of glass and light. Between a fishing weir built to catch the tide and a dike built to hold the sea back entirely, there is a common thread worth noticing. Neither one treats the sea as an enemy to be defeated once and for all. Both treat it as a partner whose rhythm has to be studied closely, respected completely, and worked with twice a day for as long as anyone intends to keep living beside it. Even the most confident piece of engineering, a barrier that can lift itself out of the seabed on command, still only ever borrows a little time and a little land from an ocean that has never actually agreed to give either one up permanently. Away from any coastline, the relationship with water changes shape again. Inland, the problem is rarely holding water back or borrowing land from it. It is guiding water deliberately, often uphill or sideways, to exactly the patch of ground where a crop needs it, and doing so reliably enough that an entire harvest and the people who depend on it can be trusted to that guidance year after year. The tools involved range from a single wooden lever to an entire mountainside reshaped by hand. But the underlying task barely changes. Take water that arrived somewhere inconvenient and move it, patiently and repeatedly, to somewhere it can actually be used. Some of the earliest attempts to guide water this deliberately appeared in the same river valleys where cities first grew. In southern Mesopotamia, engineers dug canals directly off the Tigris and Euphrates thousands of years ago, carrying river water across fields that would otherwise have depended entirely on unpredictable rain. It worked remarkably well for a long time, and then, gradually, it began working against itself. River water carries small amounts of dissolved salt, and on flat, poorly drained land under a hot sun, water evaporates while the salt it carried stays behind, accumulating in the soil year after year with nowhere to go. Wheat, the region's original staple, struggled increasingly in these conditions, and administrative records from the period show farmers shifting steadily toward barley, a hardier, more salt-tolerant grain, as fields that had once supported one crop gradually stopped supporting the other. The same irrigation that had made southern Mesopotamia's earliest cities possible had also, without anyone intending it, been quietly narrowing what those cities could still grow to feed themselves. On a steep hillside, rain that falls simply runs downhill, taking topsoil with it and offering a growing plant only the briefest, most uneven contact with moisture before gravity pulls it away. Terracing solves this with a simple idea, repeated at enormous scale. Cut the slope into a series of flat, level steps, each held in place by a stone or earthen wall, so that water settles on each step rather than rushing past it. A hillside reshaped this way slows rainfall down deliberately, holding it long enough to soak into the soil, while any excess spills gently over the lip of one terrace and down into the next, rather than carving a channel straight down the mountainside. In the mountains of northern Luzon, in the Philippines, the Ifugao people carved terraces like these directly into the contours of the landscape roughly 2,000 years ago, largely by hand, without machinery of any kind. Seen from a distance, the result resembles a vast staircase climbing into the clouds, curving around every ridge and valley rather than following any straight line, because each terrace follows the shape the mountain itself offered rather than any plan imposed on top of it. Water is drawn from mountain springs and channeled from terrace to terrace through a careful sequence of small sluices, each field farmer responsible for managing exactly how much passes through to the field below. None of it survives on its own. Walls made of packed earth or stacked stone need regular repair after every heavy rain, and a terrace neglected for even a few seasons can slump and collapse, undoing centuries of careful construction in a single wet year, which is why the terraces have always depended as much on continuous maintenance as on the original engineering itself. That dependence has become more visible in recent decades as younger generations increasingly move toward towns and tourism work rather than the demanding daily labor of tending a rice terrace, leaving some sections of this same landscape gradually less maintained than the generations before them kept it. A related idea took shape independently high in the Andes, where Inca engineers built stepped terraces called andenes into mountainsides across a large stretch of South America. Water mattered here just as much as in the Philippines, but the terraces solved a second problem alongside it: temperature. Stone-retaining walls absorb heat during the day and release it slowly overnight, creating a slightly warmer microclimate on each terrace than the open slope around it, while elevation itself let farmers plant different crops at different heights, matching each terrace's temperature and rainfall to whatever grew best there. A single mountainside, terraced this way, could functionally hold several different climates stacked one above another, each carefully irrigated by channels bringing meltwater and rain down from higher springs, distributing it step by step to fields that might otherwise have received either too much water at once or barely any at all. Many andenes fell out of use after the Spanish conquest disrupted the labor systems that maintained them, and in recent years, communities in the Peruvian highlands have begun restoring sections of these old terraces, clearing centuries of collapsed stone and choked channels by hand in the hope of returning long-abandoned mountainsides to something closer to what they once were. On the island of Bali in Indonesia, rice terraces are irrigated through a system called subak, which is as much a form of social organization as it is a piece of engineering. Farmers sharing a single water source, often a river diverted through a network of canals and tunnels, meet regularly to agree on planting schedules and water allocation, coordinated in part through small temples built at key points along the water's route. The underlying philosophy, known as Tri Hita Karana, holds that harmony depends on balanced relationships between people, nature, and the spiritual world. And in practice, this means a farmer's right to water is bound up with responsibilities toward neighbors sharing the same channel, not simply toward their own field. The system has functioned this way for roughly 1,000 years, and in 2012 it was recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, less for any single structure than for the entire coordinated relationship between water, rice, and community that keeps it running. At the very top of that relationship sits Lake Bata, the island's largest lake, held to be the ultimate source of Bali's irrigation water and watched over by a temple built on its shore. Whatever happens at the lake, in the belief that has organized the island's water for centuries, eventually reaches every rice terrace downstream from it, which places the lake's temple close to the center of the island's spiritual life as well as its agricultural one. Yemen offers an older and considerably less fortunate example of what happens when an ambitious water system eventually outgrows its own foundations. Beginning around the 8th century BCE, the Sabaean kingdom built a great dam near the city of Marib, capturing seasonal floodwater from nearby mountains and holding it back until it could be released gradually across a wide network of irrigation channels. Over the centuries that followed, the dam was raised higher and reinforced repeatedly, eventually standing some 14 meters tall and irrigating tens of thousands of acres, sustaining one of pre-Islamic Arabia's most prosperous kingdoms in the middle of an otherwise unforgiving desert. But a structure of packed earth and reinforced masonry, however well maintained, cannot be raised indefinitely, and the dam suffered a series of breaches over the following centuries before finally failing for good in the late 6th century. Tens of thousands of people are believed to have left the region afterward in search of land that could still be farmed, in what remains one of history's clearer examples of an entire kingdom's fortune rising and falling with a single piece of water infrastructure. Its story remembered in the region for centuries afterward as a lesson about the limits of even the most impressive engineering. A very different kind of solution, executed at a far larger scale, has avoided that particular fate for well over 2,000 years. In Sichuan, in southwestern China, an irrigation system called Dujiangyan has been managing the Min River since around 256 BCE without ever using a dam at all. Its designer, a hydrologist named Li Bing, split the river instead of blocking it, building a levee shaped like a fish's mouth that divides the current into an inner channel carrying water toward farmland, and an outer channel which carries away excess water and silt during flood season. A second opening, positioned precisely to take advantage of the water's natural swirling motion, spills any dangerous surplus back out before it can overwhelm the farmland downstream. Cutting the final channel through a mountain, Li Bing's workers reportedly heated the rock with fire and then doused it with cold water, cracking it apart for removal long before iron tools or explosives could have done the same job. Over 2,200 years later, the system still irrigates an area of farmland stretching across more than 5,000 square kilometers, functioning essentially as it was designed to, using nothing more than the shape of the riverbed itself. Not every ambitious water system has survived so gracefully. At Angkor, the medieval capital of the Khmer Empire in what is now Cambodia, engineers built an enormous network of reservoirs, canals and moats to capture monsoon rain and carry the city through the long, dry months that followed each year. Its largest reservoir, known as the West Baray, could hold water in a volume dwarfing the stone used to build the Great Pyramid of Giza more than 20 times over, and for centuries the system allowed a city of enormous scale to thrive in a climate that would otherwise never have supported it. But research into sediment left behind in the reservoir shows that around the time Angkor was abandoned, in the late 14th or early 15th century, the amount of water actually reaching the Baray had dropped sharply, coinciding with a stretch of severe, prolonged drought interrupted by unusually intense monsoon rains. Even a system this sophisticated had been built around a rhythm of rainfall the empire assumed would hold steady indefinitely, and when that rhythm shifted beyond what the engineering could absorb, No amount of stonework was enough on its own to hold the city together. Historians studying the collapse are careful to note that drought and erratic monsoons were only part of the story, working alongside political strain and shifting trade routes. But the water system's failure remains one of the clearest physical traces left behind of a much larger unraveling. Water this important to a harvest has also, for thousands of years, needed lifting rather than simply channeling. Along the banks of the Nile, farmers used a simple device called a shadoof, little more than a long wooden pole balanced on a post, a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other, letting a single person lift water from the river up to an irrigation channel with far less effort than hauling it by hand alone. A more elaborate solution, a rotating tube wound in a tight spiral, and often credited to the Greek mathematician Archimedes, could lift a steady stream of water simply by being turned, a design so effective that versions of it are still used today, more than 2,000 years after it first appeared, wherever water needs to move a short distance upward without any other source of power involved. Neither device required anything beyond human effort and a basic grasp of leverage or rotation, which meant a single farmer without animals or machinery could reliably raise enough water in a day to keep a modest field alive through the driest stretch of the growing season. Long before anyone could control the Nile's flood, Egyptians at least learned to measure it precisely, using structures called nilometers, often little more than a stone staircase or a marked column standing in the river itself, graduated like a giant ruler. Each year, as the flood rose, officials would read the water level against these markings and use the result to estimate the coming harvest, since a flood that rose too little meant a poor year of farming ahead, and one that rose too high risked destructive flooding rather than gentle renewal. In some periods, that single reading was even used to help set tax rates for the entire country, a whole year's expectations quietly built on how many steps of a stone staircase the river happened to cover in a given season. The Nile itself illustrates just how much a single piece of modern engineering can change a relationship with water that had held for thousands of years. Completed in 1970, the Aswan High Dam gave Egypt reliable control over the river for the first time, storing floodwater and releasing it on a controlled schedule rather than leaving farmland at the mercy of whatever the annual flood happened to bring. But the flood had never simply delivered water. For millennia, it had also delivered a fresh layer of fertile silt to farmland downstream, the same renewing cycle that first drew settlements to the river in the first place. With the flood tamed behind the dam, that silt now settles instead in the reservoir upstream, and Egyptian farmers have depended increasingly on manufactured fertilizer to replace what the river no longer delivers on its own. The dam solved the ancient problem of an unpredictable flood. It also quietly ended, in a single generation, a rhythm the region had organized itself around for longer than written history reaches back. Rice, more than most crops, depends on precisely this kind of deliberate water control, and for a reason that has little to do with the plant's thirst alone. A flooded paddy field does more than simply hydrate rice. The standing water suppresses most weeds, which generally cannot tolerate being submerged the way rice itself can, and it helps regulate soil temperature and nutrient availability in ways that dry farmed grains never benefit from. This is part of why rice cultivation and careful water engineering have appeared together again and again in unrelated parts of the world, from Balinese hillsides to Chinese river valleys to the terraced mountains of the Philippines. The crop itself all but demands the kind of precise, patient water management that terraces, canals, and shared irrigation systems were built to provide. Across the flooded deltas of the Mekong and the carefully leveled paddies of Japan, farmers time the flooding and draining of a field almost like a set of instructions, holding water deep during the weeks rice needs it most, then draining the same field nearly dry before harvest so the ground is firm enough to walk and later work without sinking. What connects a hillside cut into 1,000 small steps, a river split instead of dammed, and a reservoir the size of a small sea is not any single technique, but a shared, very old understanding that water rarely needs to be created or destroyed to be useful. It mostly needs to be persuaded, gently and repeatedly, to go somewhere it wouldn't have gone on its own, and to arrive at the moment a plant, a field, or an entire civilization actually needs it there. Some of these systems have lasted for millennia. Others eventually failed, overtaken by a shift in climate, a change in labor, or simply the slow accumulation of an unintended consequence no one had thought to watch for. Either way, the fields themselves rarely show any of this history on the surface. They just sit there, quietly green or quietly fallow, holding the answer to a question about water that was usually settled long before anyone alive today was born to ask it. Water has never only shaped fields, coastlines, and the practical mechanics of a day. In many cultures, it has also shaped what people believe, what they gather to do together, and how they mark the difference between an ordinary moment and a meaningful one. Long before anyone measured water in liters or built a system to move it efficiently from one place to another, people were already walking into it deliberately, not to drink or wash in any practical sense, but because the water itself seemed to carry something beyond its own physical properties, some capacity to mark a beginning, an ending, or a change in a person that no other substance seemed quite able to offer in the same way. Few rivers carry that weight as visibly as the Ganges, which flows down from the Himalayas across northern India before emptying into the Bay of Bengal. In Hindu belief, the river is regarded as a goddess, Ganga, and bathing in her waters is understood to cleanse not just the body, but a person's accumulated wrongdoing, offering a kind of spiritual renewal that ordinary water elsewhere cannot provide. In the city of Varanasi, built along a long stretch of stone steps leading directly down to the river, this belief becomes visible in daily life. Pilgrims descend the ghats each morning to bathe. Nearby, at other ghats built specifically for the purpose, bodies are cremated in open view, the ashes given to the river afterward, in the belief that dying and being released into the Ganges offers a particularly direct path toward liberation from the ordinary cycle of rebirth. The river carries this significance despite, and in some ways alongside, being heavily used for entirely ordinary purposes only steps away, washing, laundry, and daily bathing, continuing calmly beside the same water regarded as sacred, the practical and the spiritual sharing the same steps down to the water's edge, without either one seeming to diminish the other. Roughly every 12 years, that same river becomes the site of the largest peaceful gathering of human beings anywhere on Earth. At the Kumbh Mela, held where the Ganges meets another sacred river, tens of millions of pilgrims arrive over the course of about 2 months, camping along the riverbanks in temporary cities that appear and then vanish again within a single season. Mass ritual bathing at this confluence has been recorded for well over 2,000 years, and on the festival's most significant days, holy men and ordinary pilgrims alike enter the water together. Some pilgrims submerging 3 times in a single visit, once in memory of their mother, once for their father, and once for the river itself. Astronomers and astrologers determine the exact dates centuries in advance based on the position of the Sun, Moon, and Jupiter, so that the crowd arriving at the riverbank each time is, in effect, responding to a calendar written in the sky, timed to a river that has been flowing along the same course for far longer than anyone has been tracking the stars above it. The instinct to treat moving water as something capable of washing away more than dirt appears far beyond the banks of the Ganges. Muslims perform a ritual washing called wudu before prayer, cleansing hands, face, and feet in a sequence understood to prepare the body and mind for worship rather than simply for hygiene. Christian baptism, traditionally performed in a river, a font, or occasionally the sea, marks entry into the faith through immersion in or contact with water. In Judaism, a mikveh, a pool built and filled according to specific requirements, has long been used for ritual purification at particular moments in life. None of these traditions developed the practice by borrowing it from one another. Each arrived independently at the same basic intuition: that water, more than almost any other substance, seems suited to marking a transition from one state to another. Across much of pre-Christian Europe, that same intuition attached itself to individual springs and wells, rather than to any single great river. Many were believed to be home to a particular local spirit or deity, and people left small offerings at the water's edge: coins, pins, or scraps of cloth tied to an overhanging branch, in hopes of a cure, a blessing, or simply good favor. In the English city of Bath, a natural hot spring later dedicated to the Roman goddess Sulis Minerva has yielded, over the centuries, thousands of coins and small inscribed tablets thrown in by visitors asking for help or justice, evidence of a habit that continued for centuries after the Romans themselves had left. Even after later religious traditions replaced older beliefs, many of these wells simply continued in use, rededicated to a saint rather than abandoned outright, the water apparently too meaningful a place to leave empty of ritual altogether. In Japan, that intuition takes a more physically demanding form in a practice called misogi, in which a person stands beneath a cold waterfall or wades into a cold river or the sea, specifically to be purified by the shock and discomfort of the water itself. The practice has ancient roots in Shinto belief, in which physical and spiritual cleanliness are treated as closely related rather than separate concerns, and misogi is still performed today, often at dawn, at waterfalls considered particularly sacred, where practitioners stand directly beneath the falling water and remain there, breathing deliberately until the ritual feels complete. A gentler, far more common relationship with water runs through daily life in Japan as well, in the form of the onsen, a natural hot spring bath, and the sento, its urban, non-thermal equivalent found in ordinary neighborhoods. Bathing here is not simply about getting clean, which is generally done separately beforehand at a washing station before ever entering the water. It is treated as a period of unhurried rest, often shared quietly with strangers, in water heated naturally by the same volcanic activity responsible for the country's earthquakes and mountains. An evening onsen visit has, for many, become one of the few reliably unhurried moments in an otherwise demanding day. Water here working less as a symbol of purification than as a simple, dependable source of physical ease. On the Indonesian island of Bali, purification returns to a more overtly spiritual register at Tirta Empul, a temple built directly around a spring believed, according to local legend, to have been created by a god to revive a poisoned army. Visitors wade into a long stone pool fed by that spring, moving slowly along a row of carved waterspouts, pausing under each one to pray briefly before letting the water pour over their head and shoulders. The ritual, known as melukat, is undertaken to clear away bad luck or spiritual imbalance rather than physical dirt. And the same spring that sustains the temple's pools also, eventually, feeds into the island's wider network of ricefield irrigation, so that in a very literal sense, the water considered sacred enough to cleanse a person is the same water responsible for growing the food that person eats. Farther north, in Finland, a very different climate produced a related instinct, expressed through heat rather than a flowing spring. The sauna, a small wooden room heated by stones splashed periodically with water to release steam, has been part of daily and weekly life for centuries, traditionally used for washing, for gathering with family, and in earlier periods, even for giving birth, since a heated sauna was often the cleanest, warmest room available. Many Finns still follow a sauna session with a plunge into cold water, a lake in summer, a hole cut through lake ice in winter, treating the sharp contrast between heat and cold less as an ordeal than as a natural expected rhythm, the two temperatures completing each other rather than opposing one another. Somewhere between ritual and ordinary drinking sits a tradition that treated water itself as medicine. Across Europe, towns built around naturally mineral-rich springs, among them Baden-Baden in Germany, Vichy in France, and Karlovy Vary in what is now the Czech Republic, became fashionable destinations from at least the 18th century onward, where visitors arrived specifically to drink and bathe in water believed to relieve everything from digestive trouble to fatigue. A visit typically followed a careful daily routine, a specific number of glasses taken at a specific spring at a specific hour, sometimes prescribed almost like medication by a resident physician. Grand pump rooms and bathhouses were built around the springs themselves, and the ritual of taking the waters, as it was known, drew royalty, writers, and the merely unwell in roughly equal numbers, all trusting a particular spring's mineral content to do what ordinary water apparently could not. Water changes people just as thoroughly once it moves from ritual into what actually ends up in a cup or a glass, since almost everything anyone drinks is, in the most literal sense, mostly water, carrying whatever minerals happened to be dissolved in it long before any brewer, winemaker, or barista ever got involved. Few places demonstrate this as clearly as Burton-upon-Trent, a small English town whose local water happens to be unusually rich in gypsum and dissolved calcium and magnesium sulfates. Brewers discovered, almost by accident, that this particular mineral mix drew out the bitterness and aroma of hops especially well, producing pale ales with a clarity and character that beer brewed with softer water elsewhere struggled to match. By the late 19th century, Burton had become known as the brewing capital of the world, home to dozens of breweries producing millions of barrels a year, and other brewers eventually began adding mineral salts to their own water specifically to imitate Burton's natural chemistry, a process still known today as Burtonization. The Bass Brewery, founded in the town in 1777, grew on the strength of that local water into the largest brewery in the world within roughly a century. And by the late 1800s, Burton hosted more than 30 separate breweries, all drawing on essentially the same underground supply. The Czech city of Pilsen took the opposite path to fame, brewing with water almost entirely free of the minerals that defined Burton's ales. That exceptionally soft water, combined with a newly developed pale malt and cold fermentation, produced in the 19th century a clear golden lager, entirely unlike the darker, cloudier beers common at the time. The style, named simply Pilsner after the city itself, proved popular enough to be copied across the world, though brewers everywhere quickly learned that reproducing the recipe exactly required more than the same grain and the same yeast. Without water as soft as Pilsen's own, the beer never tasted quite the same. Sake production in Japan depends on water just as precisely, though the ideal has always been a delicate middle ground rather than either extreme. In Fushimi, a district long associated with fine sake, the local groundwater is only slightly soft, carrying a careful balance of minerals, enough potassium, phosphorus, and magnesium to support steady fermentation, but almost no iron at all, since even a small amount of dissolved iron can dull the rice's natural aroma and flavor. Water with too many minerals tends to ferment quickly, producing a drier, sharper sake, while water with too few can leave the fermentation sluggish and underdeveloped. Brewers in different regions of Japan have built distinct local styles almost entirely around whatever balance their own groundwater happens to offer, since the water itself, more than any other single ingredient, quietly decides much of what a finished sake will taste like. Wine follows a somewhat different logic, in which the water that matters most rarely reaches the glass directly at all. In many of the world's most established wine regions, vines are deliberately given less water than they could use, particularly later in the growing season, since a vine under a small amount of stress tends to produce fewer, more concentrated grapes rather than a larger, more diluted crop. This is part of why irrigation has traditionally been restricted or avoided altogether across much of Europe's oldest wine country, with growers relying instead on exactly how much rain falls and how well or poorly a particular patch of ground drains it away to shape the character of what eventually gets bottled. Two vineyards planted with the same grape only a short distance apart can produce noticeably different wine, largely because one holds on to rainwater a little longer or loses it a little faster than the other. A slope of gravel drains almost immediately after a storm, forcing vines to dig their roots down deep in search of moisture, while heavier clay nearby might hold that same rainfall close to the surface for days, and generations of winemakers, long before soil science existed as a formal subject, learned to read these small differences in drainage as reliably as any modern chart. tea drinkers reached similar conclusions long before anyone could explain the chemistry behind them. In the 8th century, the Chinese writer Lu Yu devoted much of his influential classic of tea to the question of which water made the best brew, arguing that water drawn from a mountain spring produced a noticeably better cup than river water, which in turn outperformed water drawn from an ordinary well. Centuries later, in Japan, the formal tea ceremony carried a similar sensitivity into ritual, with practitioners historically going to considerable lengths to secure water from a particular favored source before an important gathering, treating the water itself as an ingredient worth as much careful attention as the tea leaves it would eventually be poured over. Coffee tells a related story from a different direction, since the plant itself needs a fairly specific rhythm of rain and dry weather to thrive, generally found only at higher elevations in the tropics, where cooler nights slow the ripening of the coffee cherry and allow more complex flavors to develop inside it. Once picked, water re-enters the process directly. In one common method, ripe cherries are soaked and fermented in water-filled tanks for a day or two, loosening the fruit around the bean before it's washed away entirely, a process that can use many liters of water for every batch processed, and that shapes the coffee's eventual acidity and clarity in ways a different processing method, using far less water, simply cannot reproduce. Other regions skip that soaking step almost entirely, drying the whole cherry in the sun instead and relying on time and airflow rather than water to separate bean from fruit, a choice usually made less out of preference than out of necessity. In places where water for processing is simply too scarce or too expensive to spare on something that dry heat can eventually accomplish on its own. By the time any of this reaches a table, a glass, or a cup lifted for a first sip, the water responsible for most of its character is usually long gone, evaporated, filtered, or fermented into something else entirely. But it was there first, in the rain that did or didn't fall on a particular hillside, in the minerals a particular spring happened to carry, in the exact hardness of water flowing beneath one small town rather than another only a short distance away, quietly deciding, long before anyone tasted the result, roughly what that result was going to be. A drink lifted anywhere in the world carries, in this sense, a small and mostly unnoticed record of a very specific patch of ground somewhere else and the particular way water happened to move through, over, or beneath it. There is one more way water has shaped human life, and it has less to do with drinking, growing, or believing, and more to do with simply getting from one place to another, where the sea, a river, or a canal connects 2 points. Distance stops meaning quite what it means on land, and some of the most consequential engineering projects in history have been built for exactly this reason. Not to hold water back or draw it up from underground, but to let it carry people and goods somewhere they could never have reached as easily any other way. A ship moving across open water, after all, faces almost none of the friction a cart or a caravan meets crossing dry land. No mountain range to climb, no desert to cross a well at a time, only the water itself, going roughly wherever it is directed, carrying far more weight, far more easily than any animal or vehicle ever could across the same distance overland. In China, a network of canals now known as the Grand Canal has been doing exactly this for roughly 2,500 years, connecting Beijing in the north to Hangzhou in the south, across a distance of well over 1,700 kilometers. Its oldest sections date to the 5th century BCE, originally dug as separate local waterways serving individual regions, but it was Emperor Yang of Sui who, in the early 7th century, ordered these existing pieces linked, widened, and extended into a single continuous system, allowing boats to travel between two of the country's most important regions without ever crossing overland. Grain grown in the fertile south could reach the political capital in the north far faster and more cheaply by water than any cart or caravan could manage. And at its peak, thousands of boats a year moved several 100,000 tons of grain along the canal, effectively binding two halves of the country together through a single engineered waterway. Without it, a capital positioned for reasons of defense and politics rather than farmland might never have been able to feed itself reliably at all. Dependent instead on distant harvests, it had no fast, dependable way to reach. Long stretches of it remain in use today, still carrying barge traffic through cities that grew up specifically because the canal passed through them. And in 2014, the entire route was recognized by UNESCO, not for any single structure, but for the sheer continuity of purpose stretching across 25 centuries. Towns that grew up along its banks organized themselves around the canal in much the same way older cities had once organized themselves around a river, with warehouses, markets, and eventually entire neighborhoods clustering close to wherever a boat could conveniently load or unload. Elsewhere, connecting water meant cutting an entirely new channel where none had existed before. The Isthmus of Suez, a narrow strip of desert separating the Mediterranean Sea from the Red Sea, had long forced ships traveling between Europe and Asia into a journey around the entire African continent, adding weeks or months to a voyage that a channel only about 190 kilometers long could avoid entirely. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, after roughly a decade of construction, it needed no locks at all, since the Mediterranean and the Red Sea sit at almost the same elevation, allowing ships to pass through on a level path cut directly through the desert. The effect on global shipping was immediate and lasting. A route that had once required rounding the southern tip of Africa could suddenly be completed in a fraction of the time, and trade patterns that had held for centuries reorganized themselves almost overnight around this single new channel of water. Ports that had thrived for generations by serving ships on the older, longer route saw their traffic decline within a few short years, while others, positioned along the newly favored path, grew rapidly to take their place. A reminder that a single stretch of dug earth can quietly redraw a map that no war or treaty had managed to touch. Not every ambitious canal succeeded quite so completely or quite so quickly. In ancient Greece, the ruler of Corinth reportedly considered cutting a channel across the narrow isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to the Greek mainland as early as around 600 BCE, sparing ships the long and often dangerous voyage around the peninsula's southern tip. The limestone proved too hard for the tools available, and for the next 2,500 years, ships were instead hauled bodily across the isthmus on a paved overland track, one emperor even breaking ground ceremonially on the project centuries later without ever finishing it. The canal was finally completed in 1893, using dynamite and steam power unavailable to anyone who had proposed it before. Yet, even finished, it turned out too narrow and too prone to landslides from its own steep stone walls, to carry the large modern ships that make canals like Suez and Panama so valuable today. A nearly 3,000-year ambition realized just a little too late for the ships that might have used it most, now crossed mostly by tourist boats and the occasional small vessel narrow enough to fit between its towering, unstable walls. A similar ambition to Suez's, faced with far less cooperative terrain, produced a very different kind of canal across the Isthmus of Panama. Rather than dig a sea-level channel through solid rock and mountainous jungle, engineers built a system of locks, essentially giant water-filled chambers that raise or lower a ship's water level in stages, lifting vessels roughly 26 meters above sea level to cross an artificial lake before lowering them again on the far side. That lake, known as Gatun Lake, was created by damming a river and now supplies the fresh water that fills and empties the locks with every single passage, using gravity rather than mechanical pumps to do the actual lifting. A ship entering from the Atlantic side is raised through 3 successive chambers, each one filling with water from the chamber or lake above it until the vessel floats level with the next stretch of the passage, then lowered again through 3 more chambers on the Pacific side, the entire crossing achieved without a single engine or pump doing the heavy work of actually moving the water itself. The canal opened in 1914, cutting a journey between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts of the Americas from a voyage of many weeks around the tip of South America down to a matter of hours, after a construction effort that had already defeated an earlier attempt decades before, undone in large part by disease and the sheer difficulty of the terrain, rather than any failure of ambition. But the system depends entirely on rainfall to keep Gatun Lake full. Each individual ship passing through releases tens of millions of gallons of that fresh water out to sea on either side, water that then has to be replaced by rain before the lake is ready for the next vessel in line. In years of unusually low rainfall, the canal has had to limit how many ships can cross and how heavily loaded they can be, a reminder that even one of the most impressive engineered shortcuts in the world still ultimately answers to the same rain that decides so much else on this journey. The same rivers and channels that connect 2 places have just as often been used to separate them instead. A river makes an unusually convenient border, visible without a single marker or fence, difficult to cross by accident, and roughly stable from one generation to the next, even as everything built along its banks changes completely. A great many of the world's international borders follow a river for at least part of their length, not because anyone particularly wanted the 2 sides to be divided at exactly that line, but because a river was already there, doing the work of a boundary long before any treaty formally recognized it as one. The same channel that let a grand canal knit 2 halves of a country together could, arranged only slightly differently, just as easily keep 2 neighboring countries apart. Not every canal was built to shorten a journey between oceans. Some were built simply to organize a city around water more efficiently than nature alone had managed. Amsterdam's ring of concentric canals, dug outward from the city center in the early 17th century, served several purposes at once, draining and reclaiming marshy ground the same way the country's rural polders did, defending the growing city with a series of water-filled barriers, and providing an orderly transport network at a time when goods still moved far more easily by boat than by cart through narrow, unpaved streets. Merchants built tall, narrow houses directly along the canals, specifically so that goods could be hoisted straight from a boat into an upper-floor storeroom using a hook and pulley fixed to the gable, a detail still visible on many of the same buildings today. What began as flood control and city planning eventually became something closer to identity, and few visitors to the city today think of the canals as engineering at all, even though every one of them was dug, planned and maintained as deliberately as any dike holding back the sea. A canal, in the end, does not really create a new relationship with water so much as extend one that was always there. The Grand Canal simply widened and connected paths that rivers and streams had already carved. The lakes behind Panama's locks exist because a river was dammed, the same basic trick used by windmill-drained polders and stone-checked mountain streams elsewhere on this same journey. Even the sea level cut through Suez only works because two seas already sat at nearly the same height, waiting for someone to remove the strip of land between them. Water, moved deliberately across a canal built for cargo and passengers, is doing essentially the same thing it does everywhere else covered tonight, following the shape of the land, or being coaxed to follow a slightly different shape than the one it started with, always according to rules that were never actually written by the people doing the coaxing. That, in a way, has been the quiet thread running underneath every place this journey has passed through. Water rarely does anything unexpected. It simply keeps doing the same small number of things it has always done, falling, flowing, freezing, evaporating, and returning. And the enormous variety in how people actually live turns out to have far less to do with water itself than with the countless different ways humans have learned to meet it. A well dug by hand and a canal cut by dynamite are, underneath the obvious difference in scale, answers to the same basic question a village asked itself the first time it noticed a spring rising out of the ground. How do we bring this closer? Or how do we keep enough distance from it to live well here? Whether the answer took the form of a stone weir catching fish at low tide, a windmill lifting water out of reclaimed marsh, a temple built beside a rice terrace's water source, or a lock gate lifting a ship over a continent's spine, it has always been some version of the same patient negotiation carried out again and again in almost every place people have ever chosen to settle. And that, in the end, has been the real subject of this journey. Not water itself exactly, but everything water has quietly arranged around it. A village grown patiently around a single spring. A season organized entirely around a monsoon that may or may not arrive on schedule. A city built on wooden piles because the alternative was never building at all. A field cut into a mountainside, a step at a time, so that rain would stay long enough to be useful. A stream slowed deliberately in winter until it turned to ice, so that a farmer months later would have exactly what a crop needed, exactly when it needed it. A drink lifted to someone's lips somewhere in the world, carrying inside it the particular hardness of a particular spring, the particular rhythm of a particular rainy season, from a hillside its drinker may never see or even think about. A pilgrim descending stone steps toward a river considered sacred enough to carry away a lifetime of small failures. A fishing weir, rebuilt in the same low curve of stone for centuries, still catching whatever the tide happens to leave behind twice a day. A whole city, its houses tall and narrow, along a ring of water it dug for itself 4 centuries ago, going about its ordinary Tuesday without a single thought for the engineering underneath it. None of it required water to do anything unusual. It only ever moved downhill, evaporated, froze, and fell again. The same simple cycle repeating itself over and over, indifferent to whatever people happened to be doing nearby. What changed, again and again, across every place this journey has passed through, was the shape people built around that ordinary cycle, sometimes patiently, sometimes urgently, sometimes beautifully, in order to live well within it. If you happen to still be awake for this final part of the journey, there is nothing more you need to follow tonight. There will be no more new places, no more new rivers, nothing further you need to hold on to or remember. If this has been the sort of quiet company you enjoyed traveling with, you are always welcome to return for another one on a different night, whenever a different corner of the world feels right for listening to before sleep. For now, there is nothing left to understand, and nowhere further to travel. Let your shoulders settle completely into wherever you are resting. Let your breathing find its own slow, unhurried pace, without needing to think about it at all, or manage it in any way whatsoever. Let the room around you soften into darkness, or into whatever quiet light happens to be there. Somewhere out there tonight, rain is falling on a hillside it has fallen on for centuries, with no one watching it happen. A river neither knows nor cares that it has been given a name and moves on regardless. A well is standing quietly in the dark, holding water someone will draw up in the morning, patient as it has always been. Ice is sitting motionless on a mountainside, in no hurry to become anything else. A tide is turning somewhere, exactly on schedule, whether or not a single person happens to be standing on the shore to notice it. None of it requires anything further from you. It never did. You can simply let all of it go on quietly without you, exactly as it always has, and let yourself rest. Sleep well, and good night.